All right, guys. Well, if you haven't got there yet, flip over to Joshua 5. What I want to look at today is a very often ignored passage of Scripture. A passage that is, in some ways, unfortunately placed between the crossing of the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 3 and the fall of Jericho in chapter 6. So then a whole lot is often not given to the entire mass nationwide circumcision in chapter 5. But what we're going to see in this text is that this isn't a wasted chapter of Scripture. This is a chapter of people getting ready for battle. They're getting ready to take Jericho. Now, you would expect Joshua, the military commander, to give the great military speech. Boys, we're going to war, and by the strength in our arms and determination in our hearts, we will claim this victory. But that's not what we're going to get. We're going to see a rather interesting way that Joshua has the people prepare themselves for battle. Now, interestingly enough, this story takes place near the end of the deliverance from Egypt. Yeah, that sounded confusing, right? But truly, the deliverance from Egypt started 40 plus years prior to this. We all remember the plagues and all that. But the deliverance isn't going to be fully realized until the people enter the promised land, which will be a chapter later. But this is a very critical point. This isn't going to be just a chapter of millions of men being circumcised. It's going to be the story of a people coming to prepare themselves to receive the blessings of their God. And what we're really going to see as it pertains to us is that the proper preparation for the war of life is a relationship with God through Christ. Let me say it again. The proper preparation for the war of life is a relationship with God through Christ. Now, this chapter is easily divided into 5 different sections, and we're gonna go through each one of them, and we're gonna do it in 20 minutes, and we're gonna hear some awesome things that God has for us in this passage. If you would, let's just do scene 1. Scene 1 to get us started, get our kind of feet wet. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. Now it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, all the king of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. This is an incredible passage. This is a passage that if you just read it over, you could miss what is actually being said here. Do you see it? Do you see what's incredible here? Listen. All the kings of the Canaanites and the Amorites who were in the land of Jericho, all these kings, at the reputation of God, says their hearts melted. And it's fascinating, is what's clearly seen here, just this first verse, is that just the reputation of God and his people have rendered the enemy impotent right out of the gate. Interesting, it says their hearts melted and there was no spirit in them. The Hebrew word behind this word melted, their hearts melted, it would literally be pictured as sort of a block of ice. Imagine a huge block of ice, and the reputation of God blows across that ice and it turns to just a puddle on the floor. There's no fight left in them. And all they've done is heard of what God has done for his people. It's an amazing start. Now, that being the case, you would expect Joshua, once again being the military leader, to say, well, let's get our swords together and let's charge. Let's get after it and let's win this victory. But Joshua actually has a very strange way of preparing the people for this victory that is seemingly already won. Look at verse 2. Now we'll read verse 2 through verse 7. It says, at that time the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel a second time. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at that place. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt were males, And all men of war died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children whom he raised up in their place Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised along the way. So in their grand preparation to win this great battle, the military leader Joshua, instead of telling them to take up arms and take this place while all the enemy is morally defeated, he submits in obedience to the direction of God, and he circumcises the entire nation. Every male that is a part of the nation of Israel is circumcised. That's a significant act. That is something very significant going on. And in a sense, it should be terrifying. Because if you think about where they just traveled, so you got the Jordan River, who is in between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. Jordan River's in between the two. And they crossed, heading east to west. And when they crossed that river, they were in the land of Jericho. That's the very next place, the plains of Jericho. That's what's there. So they crossed over miraculously into the land of the enemy, into the enemy's backyard. And instead of defending themselves and preparing themselves for war physically, what they did was virtually incapacitate every man in the nation of Israel. What kind of crazy idea is that? But it's not a crazy idea, because what it means is, regardless of how crazy it sounds to obey what God is telling you to do, if you in fact follow in obedience, you can lay down in peace, incapacitated behind enemy lines. Interestingly enough, I did a little Google search on what the effects of this circumcision would have been as far as timeline. And it is weird to Google circumcision. Don't even do it. I've done it for you. Don't even worry about it. But they typically say, most as a circumcised adult male, this is by today's standards of surgery and that sort of thing, is for the first 3 days virtually incapacitated. You're not going to get out of bed. And after about a week, you can start to move a bit. But it takes longer than a week for you to be of any use. And so you have this entire nation of men who for weeks are not fit to fight. But because they are under the obedience of God, they are perfectly at peace. Now, another thing that's interesting to note in here is the fact that all these people needed to be circumcised. It's a little bit disappointing in a sense, but they all needed to be. And why did they need to be? Well, he goes on through 4 through 7 to talk about why they needed to be, because their parents weren't doing what they needed to do. Remember back in Genesis 17, God started the covenant of circumcision. And this is how you are in my covenant with me. You circumcise your males on the 8th day. That's what he tells Abraham. And when they came out of Egypt, they were faithful to all do that. But remember in Deuteronomy 1, when they lose faith, and therefore they're sent to wander in the wilderness until that entire generation dies off, they cease practicing circumcision, and therefore their children are, in a sense, out of covenant with God. Now the question would be, why would a parent do that? And I've wondered about it myself. Maybe the parents lost faith in God. They've been told they're not entering the land, so they just lose faith. Whatever, don't care, don't see the need. Maybe they lost focus. Maybe all those wanderings, they forget that being in covenant with their God is a big deal. Regardless of the reason it didn't happen, this entire nation needed to be circumcised. And what's interesting is the importance that parents play Because these parents set these children on a negative trajectory spiritually right out of the gate by not following the obedience of God. They set them right out of the gate on a negative trajectory. But the beauty of grace and the beauty of God and His salvation is that He's coming here to them, and He's telling Joshua, reestablish the covenant between me and my people by having them all circumcised. And that is the way grace is all the time. All through Scripture, salvation and grace is all about God chasing man, never man pursuing God on his own. So even though this entire nation was set on the wrong course, really from birth, the love and the grace of God for His people caused Him to enter in and renew that relationship. And that is grace. That is awesome. Now if you look at verse 8, now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. It just reiterates the idea. They laid there in peace for so long that they all remained in their places in the camp. They stayed in bed. That's what they did. And they were perfectly at ease in there. That point really stuck out to me in this passage. Being at perfect peace if we're in the obedience of God. Now verse 9 gave me a little trouble. I'll admit that to y'all as long as y'all won't tell anybody. Verse 9 gave me a little bit of trouble. Because verse 9 says, Then the Lord said to Joshua, Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. What does this mean? You rolled away the reproach. Now some say it is the slavery in Egypt and then the fact that they weren't circumcised. But those who were in slavery in Egypt were circumcised when they came out. So I don't think that could be. I don't remember who that commentator was, but I disagree with you. Really, I had to do some study. And when I looked at the real different Hebrew meanings of this word that the NASB translates as reproach, it also can mean taunt or ridicule. Really, and then it clicked. What has happened is Israel became a laughingstock, in a sense. Because you realize Israel, they were held captive in Egypt, who was the premier empire at the time. They were the strongest thing going. And their God was powerful enough to deliver them out of that. But they believed Him enough, they trusted Him enough to be taken out of that. But once they got out in the wilderness, they didn't trust Him enough to have Him deliver their promised land to them. They trusted Him to initiate, but they didn't trust Him to fulfill the promise. And I think that is the ridicule of Egypt, the incomplete of the delivery. It's the fact that they were a laughingstock because, well, your God was powerful enough to get you out of Egypt, but still you couldn't trust Him enough to give you what He said He's going to give you? You people are a joke. But God is saying, no, today I have removed the reproach, the ridicule. You are no longer going to be the laughingstock because the fulfillment is going to take place. Because see, the book of Joshua is the climax of that deliverance story. And in chapter 5 is the beginning of the summit to the climax. This chapter is where it really starts to head north towards the dramatic climax that of course takes place when Jericho falls a chapter later. But now these people will no longer be the laughingstock, and now it's going to start moving that way. Look at the next section. Verse 10 says, While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover. On the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert, on the plains of Jericho, they observed Passover in enemy territory. That's where they're doing all this. It's incredible. On the day after Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. And then verse 12, which could be a sermon all itself if I had any time. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land. So the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan that year. The powerful picture here is found when it says they observed the Passover. Because these are people who were not circumcised, so they weren't in covenant. They couldn't take the Passover. So for all this time, the Passover hasn't been going on. But now that this relationship with God is being restored through entering into that covenant again, the Passover is being taken. The relationship with their God is deepening. It's deepening. And once the Passover was over, they actually ate produce of the land. And then verse 12 says, the manna ceased on that very day. This is nearly shouting ground for me. And you might be going, why are you so freaked out about manna? Man, isn't manna awesome? It's heaven food. They said it tasted like honey, right? It was supposed to be awesome. And I'm sure manna was. But after 40 years, hey, anything gets old, right? But manna, the thing about why I'm so fired up that manna stopped falling is because that means the wilderness is over. The day the manna ceased is the day the wilderness was officially ending. Because the manna, remember, the manna was wilderness food that you could live off of. They weren't particularly happy about it. They complained after a short time. But you could live off manna. And there's a bunch of Christians nowadays, and what we're doing is we're living off manna. We're living off wilderness food. But what God has for us is not just wilderness food, but He has this land flowing with milk and honey that He wants to give us. So when the manna ceased, it was an amazing day because now your wilderness wanderings are over. No more just surviving for you, because you can survive off manna. But you don't have to just survive anymore. Now you're going to thrive in the land. And all I can say to us Christians is we have to be careful not to trust God enough to just survive off the manna He'll give us. But let's trust Him enough to thrive off all His blessings and all the blessings that He has for us. Amen. I'm amen and out. Then this last section, to me it ends, I see the picture like the movie rolling in my head, and I see this last section ending with a to be continued in dramatic fashion. Listen to this last section. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" He said, "No, rather, I indeed come now, as the captain of the host of the Lord." Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What is my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. The really important part of this last section is this man. Now, don't be so quick to say, well, this is an angel. An angel, one of the archangels come to fight, whatever. No. I think there's more to it than that. Because what I see here is the pre-incarnate Christ arriving. I see, in a sense, Joshua talking to Joshua. Look at this description. He's a man. He's not called an angel. Well, I know angels are called men sometimes, but he's called a man. He says, "No, I'm the captain of the host of the Lord. I'm the commander of the angel armies." Think of Revelation 19. Who comes with the army? That's Christ. Then he accepts worship from Joshua. Joshua bows in worship and he accepts it. And finally, this man has rendered the ground around him holy by his very presence. And to me, this is clearly divinity. This is clearly the pre-incarnate Christ. But the key to this section is, to me, what he says in verse 14. He says, and the ESV says, "I have now come." And what I see there clearly is not that he came or anything, but he's saying now at this point, now I have come. Now I have come here. And why has he come? Because the people have reestablished the covenant through circumcision, through obedience to circumcision. People have kept the Passover again. The manna is ending, It's time to go forward. It's time for the promised land to fall and the blessing to be received by Israel. So why has he now come? Because the people were finally properly prepared, because they now have relationship with their God again. And interestingly enough, the chapter just closes sort of abruptly with this. You are on holy ground, like the burning bush scene. But now the chapter shuts down. And the next chapter is going to begin when it's go time for Jericho. So what you clearly see here is that the pre-incarnate Christ has now shown up. That the people have reestablished covenant. Now the pre-incarnate Christ has shown up to win this victory for them. He's come to fight this battle for them. His sword is drawn. So I say again what I said at the beginning. The proper preparation for the war of life is relationship with God through Christ. Because when we're in relationship with Him, we don't have to get ourselves ready and strong and fit for the battle, because we can do 1,000 push-ups a day and not be stronger than the devil. But if we're in relationship with Christ, in that right relationship with Him, He's coming to win the victory for us. The proper preparation for the war of life is relationship with God through Christ. Amen. Thank y'all.